and welcome everyone to Women's Health Tech Wednesdays. I am your host, Nina Joshi. And before we bring on our guests, just want to remind everyone we've got two new challenges kind of coming on the horizon. We have the H-Tech Collaborative from AARP Challenge, as well as the Women's Health Tech Challenge as well. So both of these challenges are going to be taking place next year, but the applications are open. So if you are a startup, nonprofit, anyone who would be interested, all of the registration information is in the chat. And with that, we'd like to bring on our guest today, Kelly Zou, who is the head of Global Medical Analytics and Real World Evidence at Biartis. Thank you so much for coming on, Kelly.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you, HITLAB, and look forward to having a wonderful chat in front of our audience.
Wonderful. And of course, with HITLAB and with Women's Health Tech Wednesdays, we love questions. So if you have any for Kelly specifically during our conversation, please feel free to use the Q&A feature or the chat at the bottom of your screen, and I will make sure we save some time to get to it. So with that, of course, Kelly, you being a female leader in the industry and this being Women's Health Tech Wednesdays, we have to ask, what does women's health tech mean to you?
Yeah, I think, just the words, women's health tech, simply there are three words. But when I looked at these, I think immediately I think about different sort of perspectives, right? Mm-hmm. First, foremost, the patients nowadays, they have many different sort of challenges, and we know that a lot of these patients are women, and there are certain, comorbid conditions very much pertaining to women patients. But at the same time, you're thinking of, women who are, family members, women who are caregivers, and women who are healthcare providers. So there's a whole ecosystem where women can really, embrace the opportunities in terms of technology and really advance the patient care. So that's one side, which is intimate because I'm a woman, foremost. And secondly, thinking about, the role of technologies these days, in terms of that, in terms of what I do the most, will be really data-driven decision-making. So here we're having abundance of data these days and so-called big data. But at the same time, we're also thinking about what about the precision medicine? What about, the aspects where we can find the right patient, right cure at the right moment. And here, in terms of those technologies, how we can make contributions. And patients could be anyone, and there will be very diverse type of patients. And how would you find that kind of solutions through technology? And here, the technology often, will be relying on data. That's one aspect, but there are many more, such as digital, such as different omni-channels, such as devices, apps, algorithms, also unstructured data-based algorithms. For example, you can look at texts in electronic medical records. You can look at images in terms of diagnosis. You can look at pathology in biobanks. So there are so many things that can be done where women, we can make a contribution. At the same time, we can also really advance the health technologies for everybody, including women or, any other patients. Absolutely. So that's what I see as in terms of women's technology.
I love that. That's a great definition. And I like how you really expanded on it and kind of talked about all the different avenues for innovation in this space. And kind of on that note, would love if you could just tell us a little bit more about yourself, your journey, what really kind of led you to where you are right now with Biartis.
Yeah, so there are two fronts. One is really in terms of this technology me, right? So in terms of my background, in terms of what I have been doing, that could be all leading to this path, right? Is that going to be, something that's deterministic based on my education? That's one side. Another side is more the personal me. Personal me is like, as a woman, how technology interfaces with my daily life, and my hobbies, my interests may not just be technology only. So that's like the two sides. One is the professional side, one is more the personal side. So let's just talk a little bit about professional side. In terms of professional side, if you look at my background as introduced on the, on the slides already, essentially my area has been statistics foremost. And then if you see statistics as more of the umbrella of data-driven sort of applications, data-driven methodologies, and also data themselves. I think, my background is I have PhD in statistics, and also I have, very interestingly, I want to see what statistics can do in terms of impact. So I had my postdoc training in healthcare policy at Harvard Medical School. At the same time, very interestingly, because I really enjoy radiological imaging, diagnostics, and so on. So I also had joint postdoc at Brigham and Women's Hospital in terms of radiology. So how you use the data to analyze images, that's not just necessarily the structured data like a matrix of variables, but rather if you look at the features, if you look at, for example, how do you identify that if you have brain sort of tumor resection, how would you think about, where the location is? What about the borders? What kind of harms you can get? And do you resect too much? Patients cannot talk. Do you resect not enough that the border will grow back? So a lot of these very interesting sort of precision targeting type of questions. And also, how do you use images as the guidance method for you to really get to the right sort of target, so on. And so that's one area. Another area is really, so-called observational data. Observational data meaning nowadays, since the 21st Century Cures Act, there's another way that Congress defined it as real world data, meaning the data collected from the routine practice, not from, say, randomized controlled trials, as we are quite familiar with RCTs and their roles in terms of developing new medicines, new cures. But these are also the type of data that are being collected all the time. If you go to a clinic, you become, your data as patient could be in this electronic medical record system. And then if you go pick up your medications, and then your medication fill pattern will kind of help researchers to understand, do you really adhere to your therapies? When do you fall off? Do you switch to something else? So this is also called medication claims. But there are also areas that, in terms of patient centricity, patient perspectives, what about the preferences that I have? That what about the patient reported outcomes? What about certain instruments? So those are the type of data that are called real world data. In order to gain insights, you analyze such data, you gain insights, and then you derive, the real world evidence, RWE. So that has been defined by the Congress, and then that has been catching on the terminologies of RWD and RWE throughout the world. So that is really the kind of background I have professionally. But then there's also a personal side, right? So the personal side as a woman or just a person really is that, I enjoy, for example, having the interaction now, even though it's virtual, just having the Q&A chatting with you, that's really kind of enjoyment to me. And also in terms of learning more about what others are doing, essentially what HITLAB connects people. So if you go to my LinkedIn profile, the first thing, I was just chatting with, some friends and acquaintances. Before you always put your profile, this is your job, this is defines you. I actually that day was having a conversation and they said, oh, you connect people and you work on big data. I actually just, revised my headline and say, big data, women in tech. In fact, that's what I said. And not because of this, but at the same time, I also said connecting people, connecting cultures, because there are also different uses of data that could be very culturally, dependent, right? Some people, they are hesitant to see their doctors. Others, they have such good doctor-patient relationship so that they keep on coming back. That will be the influence of your adherence, such that it's not just say, clear cut that I'll just have it, I'll not have it. Sometimes there's so many different reasons and rationales. And I think that's going through every day, our minds and our interests, our hobbies, that could all relate to how you become patient and how you become a caregiver.
Absolutely.
So that's my
The
personal
culture
side.
part.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. And I love that the LinkedIn, honestly, you're making me think about my LinkedIn headline and how to make that a bit more personal, because I think that that's so telling about really the world in which you live in, right? Which is getting more and more personal. Really wanted to ask you, you have
And Nina,
such
I just want to make one comment. You're exactly, you're right, because I just talked about precision medicine, right? Just a moment ago, but there's
Yes.
also the side that's called personalized medicine. So what are some of the solutions which digital can play such a big role? Because,
Right.
some people, they really understand better in a visual environment. So how you can display the medication, information will be really helpful. Other people will be very sort of audio. So if you listen to conversation, they understand. It's like audiobooks. And yet other people, they really want to make sure they follow the regime. So if you have these apps that can remind you, it's almost like remind your appointments. So that will also be very helpful. So I think how that personalization, that aspect, not just the precision medicine, right patient, right medicine, right time. It's really personalization. It's all part of that patient centricity.
Absolutely. And I could imagine being able to really be very intentional when it comes to the personalization. I mean, it's such a worthy investment, because that's just going to lead to better adherence, better clinical outcomes. So I really think that it's really fascinating and really inspiring to see a lot of work being done to really make patients feel like they have a seat at the table, that they're empowered for their health, which I think is absolutely fascinating and amazing.
Yeah, and Nina, one caution I want to say is that you mentioned that this will lead to better outcomes, right? And I think that's exactly why, data-driven sort of assessments and decision-making is so important, because that's our hope and hypothesis. But really do the data tell you that? Because sometimes despite all these different efforts, digitization, all these innovations, you still say, okay, healthcare system is still having really challenging outcomes in the US in particular. We spend so much, in terms of healthcare spending, but at the same time, why the outcomes are still sort of lacking compared with other countries. And I think there are many, many reasons. So that's why having that health policy aspect is also very helpful.
Yeah, that is really interesting, because that is a very good point about, there's the technology, but the outcomes, there can be that gap or that disconnect. For you, how do you, what processes do you have in place, I would imagine, to continue to validate, to check, to make sure that, we are kind of steering or kind of going on that right path?
Yeah, one type of work that we do is really patient journey mapping. So, you want to look at, cross-sectionally at this time point. For example, you and I are having conversation, right? But what happened before? Just, in the last month, did I cough? Did I have a flu? Earlier, right before this session, we were just talking about, what are some potential symptoms, and for other patients, what are some comorbid conditions? And then at this point, from this point on, let's say I start to have hypothetically medication, then how do you track what happened to me? Do I get better? What about my prognosis? Do I continue coming to have the encounters with the healthcare system, or just say, oh, it's so complicated for me even to get into some of the portals, so I'm just, it's just too much effort. I like the old bedside interactions with doctors where I can talk about my symptoms. I can have that trust, the whole word about trust, and also the ethical conducts. And I think these are all very important in terms of patient's journey.
Yeah,
because patients are not alone, right? So it's a whole set of stakeholders that could really help, contribute towards that outcomes in terms of the patients and their journey.
Yeah, because you are right. You don't just start being a patient the minute you kind of enter into a healthcare interaction, right? There's so much that kind of goes beyond, when you leave and then when you come. So I think I like that you're really thinking holistically about, what is the world in which this patient lives in that is influencing how they view and interact with their health. So
Exactly.
I love that. I think that's amazing. For your role kind of within the, for Biotis with real world evidence, would love if you could kind of walk us through, what are some of the initiatives that you kind of typically work on? What are some of the challenges that you seek to solve in this role?
Yeah, so since the real world data, real world evidence, that definition is so broad, and then it could be from anywhere from prospective data collection. For example, if you conduct survey research, you want to identify the right instrument. For example, is that talking about quality of life? Is it talking about certain way that patients sort of behaviors, and those. First of all, you need to know the right measurements, right instruments. So that's that. And then secondly, in terms of a lot of aspects, such as, patient consent, in terms of HIPAA compliant, in terms of IRBs, in the US, and similarly in other parts of the world. And then that's being prospective. But then in terms of retrospective, because data are collected routinely, you inevitably will encounter messy data when they're big, right? So how do you think about things like what potential biases, what kind of data elements, how data were collected, and what is the accuracy of the data? What about quality of data? What about reliability? So a lot of those discussions then become identifying so-called fit for purpose data for your research. So you, first of all, will have your research questions in mind. Then you need to know that for what purposes do you want to look at medical records? Do you want to look at their medication fill pattern? Do you want to look at, in terms of some of the feedbacks, and do you want to look at additional really comprehensive, data types? Right. So that is very interesting because typically there are ways to look at data routinely, what data will be for what purpose. But when you talk about precision medicine, it's not so straightforward. You need to really understand the nuances of this data type versus that one. And in the US, data are very fragmented. So in terms of in your system, that's how data collected. But that's potentially on the West Coast. That's where you are. But then some of these states will have their data, different data aggregators. So how would you know that one big topic will be how do you make sure patients are generalizable in terms of the solutions you find, and what about patients' access to the healthcare systems, and also in terms of having longitudinal data, because sometimes the data are associated with their insurance, and insurance associated with their employments, right? So I think a lot of these aspects, just US alone, will be so many different, interesting aspects to examine, not to mention, other parts of the world. It could be even more complicated.
Right. You bring up a very interesting point, I think, about the fragmented data, because that's definitely something that I hear a lot about as well. And I think as there are new, really incredible technologies, wearables, all of these things, that these are just adding additional buckets or repositories of data that is just another layer of the fragment. Are there any other kind of challenges or opportunities as we kind of think and as data kind of continues to grow? Are there any other kind of things that you're seeing of like, this is another, this is kind of a problem that we should definitely solve? I know that you had mentioned just, the different data sources, the fact that it's very fragmented. Is there anything else?
Yeah, so first of all, that would be based on some horizon scanning, right? So we're talking about now, but what about, in the next, 3-4 years? Right. That's kind of what are some areas in terms of opportunities? And I can mention, a few. For example, first one is what about finding the quality data? So, data can be found and data can be useful in terms of the quality, particularly if you want the data to be used for regulatory purposes, submissions. So the quality is very important, unlike just the routine practice, right? The messy data. So that's one area. The second area is really, we're talking about patients first, right? So how patients view their data, meaning are patients, willing to provide the data? And usually if this is for innovative solutions, patients are really supportive of those. But at the same time, patients are always worried, where would my data end up with? So I think, the second aspect is really patient-centric view about their data, meaning, I need to know, what my data are being used for. That's the second question. The third one is really talking about the ethical conduct, the whole trust worthiness of the system. So it's really talking about sort of ethical considerations of so-called big data. And sometimes it's called ERWE, meaning the ethics of real world evidence. So these are all very interesting topics, meaning what about equity? What about access? What about diversity? All these different aspects. We're talking about women, but you can imagine sort of the many other aspects of how patients can really be able to even be part of the healthcare system. And data is just one component, right? You generate the data, but at the same time, they have to first have even the ability to encounter with the healthcare system.
Right. Yep. That's just the first step. Absolutely. I know that you recently won the Future Thinking Award, and I can definitely see already you're just so innovative and so future oriented. So of course, as the winner of this award, I must ask you, what do you see as kind of the future of healthcare? Are there any, I know, me and you were talking a little bit earlier about things like NLP, machine learning. Are there any, innovations or any new applications of data that kind of excite you when you think about the future?
Well, first of all, let me just mention that a lot of that is collective work. So it's not like I am the one who's just predicting in terms of the future of the healthcare or based on data. So I think one component is that recently we published a book which is to focus on real world evidence and digital innovation. And last week, we were very fortunate. We had 27 authors, and we had this book that we won the Reuters Pharma USA award this year. Congrats. So I think, thank you very much. So even though we're talking about me as the future thinker, it is, at present, it's so much contribution from everybody, the entire collective sort of team, to really think about the areas. For example, the areas about machine learning, the areas about digital, areas about IT side, and in terms of how data can be used for different jurisdictions. And others are really talking about partnerships, right? Partnerships in many different countries, regions. And I think, these areas are all sort of futuristic because, we do so much, but at the same time, there are many challenges. If you want to form partnership, for example, how do you look at the data that are from quite distributed? They are in different areas in the world, and then you cannot easily sort of flow the data or even connect the data. There's an issue which is called interoperability. So from one system to another system, then there's another issue which is called international data flow. What are some countries that can be adequately having the right decisions for jurisdictions such as the European GDPR data privacy law to consider? And also, there are other aspects. And I also want to mention that there are other areas such as just the outcomes research. How do you think about the right, data science and statistical methods to analyze the outcome? And how do you really minimize the biases in terms of those algorithms? So these are sort of many areas for consideration, not only now, but going into the future.
Absolutely. And I love that you really kind of speak to the need for collaboration. I think just in general, right, as we continue, the more people that we kind of invite, the more people that we're able to bring and work on these things together, I think, the better the technology and then the better the application. So I love that. And I realized that we only have 2 minutes left. I don't know where the time went. So many great questions I still have for you. Well, we'll
And
have to
Nina,
do a part
I do
two.
want to have a disclosure is that I want to emphasize the views I just presented, really views of my own. Okay,
Right,
not
of
just say
course.
representing my employer. So that's a standard sort of disclosure.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is just us and Kelly. But I really kind of wanted to ask you, as we kind of wrap up our conversation, which is definitely just part one, we will definitely need to bring you back, but wanted to kind of ask you, which is my favorite question to ask our guests, but if you kind of have any words of advice that you would like to share with our group, either words of advice that maybe a mentor had given you that you want to share with us, or just anything that you've learned from your career, any advice that you have?
Yeah, so I think, in terms of women, first of all, it's very important to think about potential opportunities. Part of that is really through mentorship, and others will be through sponsorship, right? So you will find women supporting each other. At the same time, you also will have allies supporting, us, and vice versa. Allies support us. We could also support, a sort of having this diverse perspectives, as I mentioned when I discussed with you in terms of your first question, I think will be really helpful, because when you think about the healthcare system, our customers, the patients are so diverse. So if we have women perspectives and other diverse perspectives, I think that would be very helpful.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I think that was a wonderful piece of advice, and definitely speaks to the power of being able to have that diversity and inclusivity. I wanted to thank you so much, Kelly, for taking the time to chat with us today. I learned a ton, really, really appreciate it. And just wanted to let everyone know that next week we will be bringing on some folks from the Columbia Business School. So please be sure to check that out. And like I mentioned earlier, we have 2 applications open for 2 challenges. Very exciting. The first is with AARP. The second is with the Women's Health Tech Challenge for HITLAB. So please be sure to check all of that out. Wanted to thank our sponsors, Goodwin and Witham, for sponsoring this conversation. And of course, one large, huge shout out to Kelly. Thank you so much, Kelly, for taking the time to chat. Definitely looking forward to having you on another time.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody. Thank you,
Thanks,
Nina.
everyone. See you next Wednesday.